Don't let her leave. That was the first thing I heard before I even understood I was in danger. The soft click behind me, barely louder than a breath, but final in a way that made my chest tighten instantly, like the air had just been portioned out, and I wasn't sure how much of it I was allowed to keep. 20 minutes earlier, everything had still felt normal, or at least as normal as a last-minute shift at a private auction in Midtown could feel. The kind of place where the marble floors reflected too much light. And everyone spoke just a little too quietly, like secrets were part of the dress code. And I had only taken the job because rent was due in 3 days and my manager had begged me to cover, promising it would be easy. Just carry trays, smile, don't listen, don't ask questions, and leave before midnight. I remember thinking the room smelled like expensive cologne and polished wood, that kind of clean that doesn't feel comforting, just controlled. And I kept my head down the way I always do, counting steps, balancing glasses, pretending I belonged there even though every instinct told me I didn't. Then my phone vibrated against my apron, sharp and unexpected, and I almost ignored it. I should have ignored it, but something in me reacted before my mind caught up, like muscle memory I didn't know I had. And I stepped into a quiet corner near one of the pillars and answered without thinking, my voice slipping into Italian, so naturally it startled even me. The words soft, quick, familiar in a way that didn't make sense, like a song I hadn't heard in years but somehow still knew by heart. I only spoke for a few seconds, nothing important, just reassurance, just habit. But when I hung up and turned back toward the room, everything felt different, like the air had shifted without warning. And that's when I noticed him, not because he moved, but because everything else seemed to move around him, people adjusting, stepping aside, lowering their voices without being told. And his eyes were already on me, steady, unreadable, like he had been watching long before I realized it. I told myself it was nothing, just a coincidence, just another powerful man in an expensive suit, but then he leaned slightly toward the man beside him and said something I couldn't hear, and within seconds, I heard it, that soft mechanical sound behind me, the door sealing shut, and suddenly the room didn't feel large anymore. It felt contained, deliberate, like a space designed to keep something in, and when I looked back at him again, he wasn't looking at me like a stranger, he was looking at me like he had just found something he had been searching for, and I didn't know why, but I knew, in that exact moment, that whatever I had just said on that phone call had changed everything. I should have stayed quiet, kept my head down, finished my shift, and walked out like nothing had happened. But the moment that door locked, something in my chest told me I had already crossed a line I could not see. I tried to move anyway, forcing my legs to take one step, then another, telling myself I was imagining it, that doors in places like this probably locked automatically, that it had nothing to do with me. But the weight of his gaze followed me across the room, steady, unhurried, and far too certain, and I could feel it without looking, like heat against my skin. I picked up a tray from the service table just to give my hands something to do, but my fingers were not as steady as they had been before. The glasses clinked softly, betraying me, and that was when he started walking toward me, not fast, not aggressive, just inevitable, like the room had rearranged itself to bring him closer. Conversations did not stop, music still played, but everything around him adjusted, creating space without being told. And I realized this was not influence. This was control. I told myself not to panic, that powerful men notice things all the time, that I was just another face in a uniform. But when he stopped in front of me, close enough that I could see the fine lines of focus in his expression, I understood that I was wrong. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his voice low, calm, almost polite. But there was something underneath it, something that did not ask twice. I blinked, trying to buy time, pretending not to understand, even though I knew exactly what he meant. "I am sorry," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. His eyes did not leave mine. "The language," he clarified. "You were not guessing. You were fluent." My heart skipped, just once, sharp and undeniable, and I forced a small, nervous smile, the kind I used with difficult customers. "It was nothing, just a few words I picked up growing up," I said, hearing how thin the explanation sounded even as I spoke it. He tilted his head slightly, studying me like I had just given him an answer that confirmed something instead of denying it. And that was worse, much worse. "From who?" he asked. The question landed heavier than it should have. Simple words. carrying too much weight. And for a second, I hesitated, because the truth was I did not know. Not really, just fragments of memory. A voice I could not fully place, lullabies I had never questioned until now. And that hesitation, that tiny pause, was all he needed. "You do not know," he said quietly, not asking, stating it like a fact he had already filed away. My throat tightened. "My grandmother, I think," I said, grasping for something that sounded solid. His gaze flickered, just for a second, but I saw it, recognition, or maybe calculation, and then it was gone, replaced by that same controlled calm. He reached out, not to grab, not to threaten, just to gently turn my wrist upward, his fingers light, but firm enough that I could not pull away without making a scene, and his eyes dropped to the thin chain around my wrist, the small charm I had worn for as long as I could remember, something I had never taken off because it felt important, even if I never knew why. His thumb brushed against it, barely there, but it sent a strange, electric awareness through me. Not fear exactly, something sharper, like being seen too clearly. "This is not random," he murmured, almost to himself. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing under his touch. "It was a gift," I said quickly. "I have had it since I was a kid." And for the first time, something shifted in his expression, not softer, but deeper, like I had just unlocked a door I did not even know existed. When he looked back up at me, there was no doubt left in his eyes, only certainty, and that was the moment I realized he was not trying to figure out who I was. He already believed he knew, and whatever answer he had come to, it was not going to let me walk out of that room. It happened so fast I almost missed it. The moment his attention shifted from curiosity to decision, like a switch flipping somewhere behind those steady eyes, and suddenly the room was no longer a place I was working in, it was a place I was being kept in. He released my wrist slowly, deliberately, as if the contact had already told him everything he needed to know, and for a second I thought that was it, that he would step back, lose interest, let me disappear into the background again, but instead he turned slightly, just enough for the man standing a few feet behind him to catch the movement, and without raising his voice, without even looking in that direction, he said, "Stay with her." And the words were quiet, controlled, but they carried the kind of authority that did not leave room for interpretation. I felt it immediately, the presence shifting at my side, not touching me, not blocking me outright, but close enough that I understood. I was no longer moving freely. "I need to get back to work," I said quickly, trying to keep my tone even, trying to sound like this was still a normal interaction, like I still had control over what happened next, but my voice did not feel like mine anymore. It felt thinner, uncertain. He looked at me again, and this time there was something almost unreadable in his expression, not anger, not suspicion, something closer to focus, like he was placing me into a pattern only he could see. "You will," he said calmly, "but not yet." And that simple answer landed heavier than any refusal could have. My pulse picked up, each beat louder than the music still playing in the background, and I became aware of everything all at once, the distance to the nearest exit, the quiet presence of men positioned near the doors, the way no one else seemed to notice, or maybe they noticed and chose not to look, and that realization made something cold settle in my chest. "I really do not understand what this is about," I said, forcing the words out, needing to say something, anything that might shift the moment back in my favor. But even as I spoke, I could hear the doubt in my own voice. He studied me for a long second, and I had the strange, unsettling feeling that he was not just listening to what I said, but to what I was not saying, to the spaces in between my words. "That is exactly the problem," he replied quietly. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "Then tell me," I said, a little sharper this time, because fear was starting to turn into something else, something edged with frustration, because from where I am standing, this feels like a misunderstanding. And for the first time, something almost like a reaction crossed his face, not amusement, not quite, but something that acknowledged the word. "If it were a misunderstanding," he said, "you would have walked out of here already." And the truth in that statement hit me harder than anything else he had said. I glanced toward the door without meaning to. Just a flicker, but it was enough for me to see that. It was still closed, still guarded, still not an option, and when I looked back at him, my chest tightened again. You are not in trouble, he added after a beat, and the way he said it should have been reassuring. But it was not. Not when it was followed by, you are just important. And that word, important, landed wrong. Heavy, unfamiliar, like it did not belong to me. I shook my head slightly, almost reflexively. You have the wrong person, I said, more quietly now, because part of me needed that to be true, needed this to be something that could be corrected and undone. His gaze did not waver, not even for a second. No, he said, calm, certain, absolute. I do not. And in that moment, I realized something that made my stomach drop. He was not trying to figure out if I mattered. He had already decided that I did, and whatever reason he had, whatever connection he thought he saw, it was strong enough to lock doors, to shift the entire room, to rewrite the rules I thought I was standing on. And for the first time since I had picked up that call, I understood that this was not about a mistake. It was about something I did not remember, something I did not understand, something that had just found me whether I was ready or not. The word important stayed with me longer than anything else he said, echoing in a way that did not make sense, because nothing about my life had ever fit that word, not the apartment I could barely afford, not the jobs I rotated through just to stay afloat, not the half-remembered fragments of a childhood that never quite lined up no matter how many times I tried to piece them together. I took a slow breath, steadying myself the way I had learned to do in difficult situations, focusing on small details to keep from unraveling. The weight of the tray still in my hands, the faint hum of conversation behind me, the polished floor beneath my shoes. But none of it felt grounding anymore. It felt distant, like I was standing slightly outside of my own life. If I am so important, I said carefully, choosing each word like it mattered, then you should be able to tell me why. And this time I did not look away, because something inside me needed to push back, even if I did not fully understand what I was pushing against. For a moment, he said nothing, and that silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional, like he was deciding how much I was allowed to know. And that realization unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant the answers existed, just not for me. He glanced briefly toward the man beside me, the one who had been instructed to stay, and then back to me. Walk with me, he said. Not a request, not even a command, just a statement that assumed compliance. And before I could respond, he turned, already moving, already expecting me to follow. I hesitated for half a second, my instincts screaming to stay where I was, to refuse, to demand clarity before taking another step. But the presence at my side shifted slightly, a subtle reminder that standing still was not as neutral as it seemed. And so I moved, one step, then another, falling into pace beside him because the alternative did not feel like an option. We did not go far, just across the room to a quieter corner near a set of tall windows that overlooked the city, the lights outside stretching into the distance like something unreachable. And when he stopped, I stopped too, suddenly aware of how close everything felt despite the open space. Start from the beginning, he said, turning to face me fully now, his attention narrowing in a way that made it hard to think clearly. Who taught you that language? And there it was again, the same question, but this time it felt heavier, more precise, like the answer mattered in a way I still could not see. I shook my head slightly, frustration slipping through despite my efforts to stay composed. I already told you, I do not remember clearly, I said. It was just always there. And even as I spoke, I heard how strange that sounded, how incomplete, but it was the truth, or at least the only version of it I had. His gaze did not soften, but it shifted, just enough to suggest he was adjusting something internally, recalculating. Always, he repeated quietly, as if testing the word. Nothing is always. And there was something in the way he said it that made my chest tighten again, like he was not just disagreeing, he was rejecting the possibility entirely. Then I do not know what you want me to say, I replied, my voice lower now, steadier in a different way, because the fear was still there, but it was no longer the only thing I felt. There was confusion, yes, but also a growing sense that this moment was not random. That's something about me, something I had never questioned before, had just become the center of something much bigger. He studied me for another long second, and then, without warning, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out his phone. tapping the screen once before turning it slightly toward me, not fully offering it, just enough for me to see. And what I saw made my breath catch, not because I understood it immediately, but because it felt familiar in a way I could not explain. An old photograph, slightly worn at the edges, showing a woman I did not recognize standing in a sunlit courtyard, her dark hair pulled back, her expression calm, and in her arms, a small child, no older than 3, wearing a thin bracelet with a charm that looked exactly like the one resting against my wrist. I stared at it, my thoughts scrambling to catch up, to make sense of what I was seeing. But before I could say anything, before I could even form the question, he spoke, his voice quieter than before, but somehow more certain than ever. That is not a coincidence. And in that moment, I realized something that made everything inside me shift. This was not about what I remembered. It was about what had been kept from me. And for the first time, I was no longer just afraid of him. I was afraid of the possibility that he was right. My eyes stayed on the photo longer than I meant them to. Like if I looked away too soon it would disappear and take whatever fragile connection it carried with it. And the longer I stared, the more something inside me began to shift. Not a memory exactly, not something clear or whole, but a feeling, a pull, like recognition that did not have words yet. I do not know her, I said finally, my voice quieter than before, because even as I said it, I was not completely sure it was true. He did not take the phone back immediately, as if he wanted me to keep looking, to keep searching for something he already believed was there. And that made my chest tighten in a different way, not just fear now, but pressure, like I was being asked to remember something I had never been allowed to forget. Look again, he said softly, not pushing, not raising his voice, but there was no room to refuse, not really, and so I did. I let my gaze move over the image more carefully this time, the way the woman held the child, protective but calm, the way the light fell across her face, and then the bracelet, small, delicate, unmistakable, and suddenly it did not feel like just a similarity anymore. It felt intentional. I swallowed, my fingers instinctively brushing against my own wrist, grounding myself in something real, something present. Lots of people wear things like this, I said, though the words felt weak even as they left my mouth. His expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened. Slightly, like he had expected that response. Not that one, he said, and there was something final in the way he spoke, like this was not speculation, it was confirmation. I shook my head, a small movement, more to myself than to him, because none of this fit, none of it aligned with the life I knew, with the story I had been told. You are asking me to believe that I am connected to what, exactly? I asked, the question coming out more strained than I intended. He finally lowered the phone, slipping it back into his jacket with a measured motion, like he had shown me exactly as much as he needed to and nothing more. I am not asking you to believe anything, he said. I am telling you that something about you does not match the life you think you have lived, and that sentence landed heavier than anything else, because it was not dramatic, it was not threatening, it was quiet, precise, and far too possible. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, my thoughts racing now, trying to find something solid, something I could hold on to that made sense. My records are real, I said quickly. My name, my school, everything. It is documented. And for a second, I clung to that, to the idea that paper and records meant truth. But his gaze did not waver. Documents can be created, he said, and they can be changed. And just like that, the ground I had been standing on felt less stable. I shook my head again, more firmly this time, because I needed to push back against that, needed something to stay real. No, that is not possible, I said, but even as I spoke, doubt slipped in, quiet and unwelcome, because there were gaps, things I had never questioned before, things I had accepted without looking too closely. He watched me carefully, not interrupting, not correcting, just letting the realization unfold at its own pace, and that patience made it worse, because it felt like he knew exactly where my thoughts were going. Why me? I asked finally, the question barely above a whisper, because if any of this was even slightly true, then there had to be a reason, something that connected all of it, something that explained why he had locked a room full of people just to keep me inside. He held my gaze for a long second, and when he answered, his voice was quieter than before. but carried more weight than anything he had said yet, because someone went to a great deal of effort to make sure you would never be found. And the words settled into the space between us like something permanent, something that could not be undone. And in that moment, I understood something I had not been ready to see before. This was not just about the past. It was about why that past had been hidden. And for the first time, the idea of leaving this room did not feel like freedom. It felt like stepping into something I was completely unprepared for. The way he said it did not leave room for doubt, not in his mind, not in the way he looked at me like I was something uncovered rather than discovered. And that difference mattered more than I wanted it to, because it meant this was not a coincidence to him. It was a conclusion. I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the edge of the tray before I realized I was still holding it, still pretending I was just working, still trying to anchor myself to something normal, and slowly, carefully, I set it down on the nearest surface, because I could not keep pretending anymore, not when nothing about this felt like something that would simply pass. If someone went through that much effort, I said, my voice steadier now in a way that surprised even me, then why would it matter now? And the question felt important, more important than anything else, because if I had truly been hidden, then something must have changed for me to be standing here, exposed, under his attention. His gaze shifted slightly, not away from me, but inward, like he was measuring how much to say. And that pause told me everything I needed to know. There was more, much more, and he was deciding how far to let me in. Because you spoke, he said finally, and the simplicity of that answer hit me harder than anything complicated could have, because it was so small, so ordinary, just a few words on a phone call, something I had done without thinking, without meaning, and yet it had been enough to unravel. Something carefully built over years. I shook my head faintly, trying to process that. That cannot be enough, I said. But even as I spoke, I remembered the way his expression had changed, the way the room had shifted, the way everything had locked into place the moment I had spoken those words. It is not just what you said, he continued, his voice calm, precise. It is how you said it. And there it was again, that focus, that certainty, like he was tracking something far more specific than I understood. I frowned slightly, confusion threading through the fear. It is just a language, I said, though the words felt thinner now, less convincing even to me. No, he replied, and this time there was no softness at all, only quiet correction. It is a dialect, a pattern, something that belongs to a very specific place, a very specific family. And something in my chest tightened at the word family, not because I recognized it, but because I did not. I looked at him, really looked this time, trying to understand how he could be so certain about something I had never questioned. You think I belong to some family I have never heard of? I said, and the sentence sounded unreal, like it belonged to someone else's life. I think, he said slowly, that you were taken out of it. And those words settled heavily, shifting everything again, because they did not suggest chance, they suggested intention. I let out a slow breath, my thoughts racing faster now, pulling at pieces of memory that had never quite made sense, the way certain questions had always been redirected, the way some answers had always felt incomplete. And for the first time, I did not push those thoughts away, I let them surface, even though they made something inside me uneasy. And if you are wrong, I said after a moment, because I needed that possibility to exist, needed a way for this to still be nothing more than a misunderstanding. Then what? And this time, when he looked at me, there was something different in his expression, not doubt, never that, but awareness, like he understood exactly what that question meant to me. Then you walk out of here, he said simply, and this ends. And for a second, just a second, that sounded like relief, like a clear path back to the life I understood. But then he added, quieter, almost like an afterthought that carried more weight than the rest. But if I am right. And he did not finish the sentence, he did not need to, because the look in his eyes said everything. And in that moment, I realized something that made it impossible to breathe normally. He was not trying to convince me. He was waiting for me to realize it myself. And the closer I got to that realization, the less this felt like something I could walk away from. The silence after his unfinished sentence stretched longer than anything he had actually said, and I realized that was the point. He did not need to explain the consequences. He only needed me to feel them, to understand that there was a version of this night where I walked out and everything stayed the same, and another version where nothing ever would again. I drew in a slow breath, forcing my thoughts to steady, because if I let them spiral now, I would lose whatever control I still had, and I could not afford that. Not here, not with him watching me like I was already part of something I did not remember agreeing to. Then show me, I said finally, the words coming out quieter than I expected, but firmer than I felt, because if he was so certain, then there had to be more than a photograph and a feeling. There had to be something real, something undeniable. His gaze held mine for a second longer, measuring, assessing, and then he nodded once, a small movement that felt like a decision being made. He reached for his phone again, but this time, instead of turning it toward me immediately, he tapped through something, his attention briefly shifting to the screen, and in that moment, I noticed something I had missed before. The way the men positioned around the room had subtly adjusted again, not drawing attention, not interrupting the flow of the evening, but closing distance, tightening a perimeter I had not even realized existed. It made my chest tighten, not because they were doing anything obvious, but because they were not. Everything about this was quiet, controlled, deliberate. There was a report filed 24 years ago, he said, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond us, but clear enough that every word landed exactly where it was meant to. A child missing, no confirmed identity, no official follow-up, and he lifted his gaze back to mine. Watching carefully for my reaction, I frowned. Slightly, the number catching in my mind, because it was too close, too exact, lining up in a way I did not like. That could be anyone, I said, but my voice lacked the conviction it should have had. He did not argue, did not correct me. He simply turned the phone toward me, and this time it was not a photograph. It was a document, scanned, aged, the kind of thing that looked official without needing explanation. And even before I read the words, I felt something shift inside me, like recognition moving just beneath the surface. Location, he said quietly, and my eyes followed the line on the screen. A small town name in Italy that meant nothing to me, or at least it should have. And yet the moment I read it, something in my chest tightened, sharp and unexpected, like a memory trying to surface but not quite breaking through. I shook my head instinctively, stepping back half a step without realizing it. No, I said under my breath, not to him, not really, but to the feeling itself, because it did not make sense. It could not make sense. You recognize it, he said, not asking, not guessing, just stating what he saw in my reaction, and that certainty made it worse, because I could not deny what my body had already done. I have never been there. I replied quickly, but the words felt disconnected, like they belonged to logic, not to whatever instinct had just pulled at me. He watched me carefully, and then, more quietly than before, he added, "You do not have to remember it to be connected to it." And something about that sentence settled deeper than the rest, because it did not demand proof, it explained the absence of it. I pressed my lips together, trying to steady the rush of thoughts, the fragments that were starting to feel less like imagination and more like something real, something hidden, and for the first time since this began, I felt something shift in a way I could not ignore. Not just fear, not just confusion, but something else. Something closer to realization, fragile and incomplete but impossible to push away. I looked at him again, really looked this time, and the question that came out was quieter than any before it. Why do you care? And that question mattered more than anything else, because if he was right, if any of this was true, then his interest was not random, it was personal. His expression changed then, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. A subtle tightening, a flicker of something beneath the control, and when he answered, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. Because someone disappeared that night, he said, and I have been looking for the truth ever since. And the way he said truth made it clear this was not just about the past. It was about something unfinished, something unresolved, and for the first time, I understood that whatever I was to him, whatever connection he believed existed, it was not something he was willing to let go. Not now, not after getting this close. And that realization made one thing painfully clear. This was no longer just about whether I could leave. It was about whether I would ever be the same if I did. The way he said it lingered longer than the words themselves. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, like something that had been carried for years without ever being put down, and I realized that whatever this was, it did not start tonight. It did not start with me answering that call. It had been waiting, quiet and patient, long before I ever walked into that room. I drew in a slow breath, trying to hold on to something stable, something I could still control, but the edges of everything felt different now, like the life I had been standing in had shifted just enough to reveal something underneath it. "You are saying I am connected to something that happened 24 years ago," I said, my voice low, careful, because saying it out loud made it feel more real than I was ready for. "But I have lived my entire life here. I have records, school, jobs, people who know me." And I heard the insistence in my own voice, the need to anchor myself to something documented, something provable. He listened without interrupting, his attention unwavering, and when I finished, he nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, like he had expected that response. "And all of that can still be true," he said, "and still not be the whole truth." And there it was again, that quiet precision. The way he spoke like he was not trying to convince me, only to place the pieces in front of me and let me see how they fit. I shook my head faintly, but slower this time, because the certainty I had held on to before was not as solid anymore. "That does not explain why you," I said, because that part mattered just as much, maybe more. Why you would be the one to recognize it. And the question hung there between us, heavier than the others, because it pointed directly at him, at his involvement, at the reason this was not just coincidence. For a moment, he did not answer, and that pause felt different from the others, not measured, not strategic, something closer to restrained, like he was deciding whether to let me see something he usually kept hidden. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, quieter, but there was something in it that had not been there before, something personal. "Because the woman in that photo," he said, "was the last person my mother trusted." And the words settled into me slowly, piece by piece, connecting in ways I had not expected, because this was no longer just about a missing child or a hidden identity. It was about him, about his past, about something that had shaped the way he stood here now. I held his gaze, searching for something, anything that might tell me this was still distant, still separate from me. But there was nothing distant about the way he looked at me, nothing uncertain, only that same steady focus, like I was, standing at the center of something he had been circling for years. "And the child?" I said, my voice quieter now, because the question felt different, heavier. "What happened to her?" And even as I asked it, something inside me tightened, like I already knew I would not like the answer, or worse, that I would recognize it. His expression did not change, but there was a shift, subtle, almost imperceptible, like a line had been crossed simply by asking. "She disappeared," he said. "No trace, no confirmation, just gone." And the simplicity of it made it more unsettling, not less, because it left too much space, too many unanswered questions. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry again. "And you think that is me?" I said, and this time it was not denial, not fully. It was something else, something closer to testing the idea, seeing how it felt when spoken aloud. He did not hesitate, not even for a second. "I think," he said, his voice steady, certain, "that you are the only explanation that makes sense." And the finality of that statement settled over everything, quiet and undeniable. And for the first time since this began, I realized that this was no longer about proving him wrong. It was about whether I was ready to find out. What happened if he was right? Because if he was, then everything I thought I knew about myself was not just incomplete. It was built on something that had been carefully, deliberately hidden, and the closer I got to that truth, the more it felt like stepping forward would change everything in a way I could not undo. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the silence that settled between us felt heavier than anything that had come before it. Not tense, not rushed, but final in a way that made it impossible to ignore what had already been set into motion. I looked at him, really looked, and saw something I had missed earlier. Not just control, not just certainty, but patience. The kind that came from waiting too long for something that mattered too much. And suddenly I understood that this was not a coincidence for him. It was an answer, one he had been searching for long before I ever stepped into that room. I exhaled slowly, my thoughts no longer racing in every direction, but narrowing, focusing, because there was only one question that mattered now, not whether he believed it, but whether I was willing to find out. If you are right, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. Then what happens next? And this time, the question was not defensive, not dismissive, it was real. His gaze held mine, steady and unwavering. And for the first time, there was no hesitation in his response. Then we stopped pretending this is a coincidence, he said. And the way he said it made something inside me shift again, because it meant there was no easy version of this. No simple explanation that would let me walk away unchanged. I swallowed, my fingers brushing lightly against the bracelet on my wrist again, the small piece of metal that had never meant anything before and now seemed to carry more weight than I could understand. And if I do not want that? I asked, because I needed to hear it, needed to know that choice still existed. Even if I already suspected the answer, his expression did not harden, did not turn cold. It stayed exactly the same, controlled, measured, and that somehow made it more serious, not less. Then you leave, he said, and you go back to your life. And for a second, just a second, that sounded like relief, like a door opening, like an ending that did not require anything from me. But then he added, quieter, more deliberate. But you will not stop wondering. And that was the part that stayed, the part that settled into me and refused to move, because he was right. I already knew he was right. The questions had already started, and there was no version of this where I could unhear what he had said or unsee what he had shown me. I looked away briefly, toward the window, toward the city stretching out beyond the glass, lights flickering in the distance like something constant, something unaffected by what was happening here. And I tried to imagine walking out, stepping back into that world, pretending this night had not shifted something fundamental inside me. But the thought felt hollow, incomplete, like trying to ignore a truth that had already begun to take shape. You said someone made sure I would not be found, I said after a moment, turning back to him, my voice quieter now, but clearer, which means they had a reason. And even as I spoke, I felt it, the weight of that realization, because this was not just about being hidden, it was about why. He nodded once, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging that I had reached the same conclusion he had already accepted. Yes, he said, and there was no hesitation, no attempt to soften it. And people do not go to that kind of effort without expecting something in return. And that sentence landed differently, sharper, because it suggested something active, something ongoing, not just a past event, but something that could still matter now. My breath caught slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the realization that this was bigger than I had wanted it to be. Bigger than a missing piece of identity, bigger than a forgotten past. This was something that had been shaped, controlled, directed. So this is not over, I said, more to myself than to him. But he answered anyway, his voice low, certain, no. And that single word settled everything, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a kind of final clarity that made it impossible to ignore. I closed my eyes for a brief second, just long enough to steady myself, just long enough to accept that whatever choice I made next would not be a simple one. And when I opened them again, I looked at him differently, not just as someone powerful, not just as someone dangerous, but as someone who had been standing at the edge of this truth long before I ever knew it existed. One night, I said finally, the words coming out before I could second-guess them, because I knew if I waited, I might walk away instead. I will stay one night, and you tell me everything you know. And even as I said it, I felt something shift, something irreversible, like stepping across a line that had been there all along. He studied me for a moment, and then he nodded, once, decisive, like the agreement had already been expected. One night, he repeated, and the way he said it made it clear that this was not just a promise. It was the beginning of something neither of us would be able to walk away from easily. I drew in a slow breath, aware of everything again, the room, the people, the quiet presence surrounding us. But none of it felt the same anymore, because now I understood something I had not before. I had not been locked in that room to be trapped. I had been kept there because the moment I spoke, the moment I was recognized, leaving had stopped being simple, and for the first time, I was not entirely sure I wanted it to be.